"Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with unclean hands?" This is the question put to Jesus by the Pharisees. Saint Mark, in his Gospel, explains to us that the Pharisees do not eat unless they wash their hands, and that they are attached to many other traditions, the washing of cups, pots and dishes, and the sprinkling of themselves when they come from the marketplace, before they take their meals. At the time of Jesus, washing one's hands and sprinkling oneself when one comes home from the market was a way of showing that a Jew was somebody set apart, somebody who belonged to the chosen race. When the Pharisees accused the disciples of not washing their hands, what they mean is that in the marketplaces, the apostles had contracted a ritual impurity by moving with foreigners. And Jesus himself was being touched by all sorts of people in the marketplaces. Respecting the traditional rites of purification was a way of reminding oneself that one had to preserve one's identity by keeping oneself free of the stain of the others and thus be faithful to the covenant. That was a lofty ideal, but eventually it became an exterior ritual and came to signify something else. It is the exterior that makes impure one's interior. What is the origin of these customs? At the time of the liberation from slavery in Egypt, the people had to promise allegiance to God and obey his laws in all spheres of life. And so Moses gave them certain directives for their day-to-day existence. Thus, for example, in the desert of Sinai, when the people were hungry and the manna fell from the skies, each one could gather only what was needed for the day. Nobody was allowed to stock anything for tomorrow. That was a way of seeing to it that everybody got something to eat, and a way of placing one's confidence in God, who provided for his people every day. In remembrance of this, in the temple every evening, whatever that remained of the sacrifices of the day were burned with fire according to fixed rites and laws. As for the daily life, each one led it in his own way. In this way, little by little, the sacred got separated from concrete life. Only the sacred with its cult became religious. This situation led to a multiplication of rules and regulations, and at the time of Jesus, the people had to bear the brunt of innumerable directives that were said to be coming from the tradition of the elders. This is the danger in any religion, becoming a collection of rites and doctrines that get the upper hand over one's personal relationship with God. Have you noticed that the quarrels among us Christians are often for liturgical or dogmatic reasons? When the wise man points at the moon with his finger, the fool looks at the finger. In moments of crisis, when there was a danger of war or of famine, the elders thought that the calamity that was profiling on the horizon was a punishment from heaven for having abandoned the ancestral customs. And they imposed on the people the practices of old that were in the beginning simply associated with one or another particular context. Thus, the tradition of the ancestors got cut off from the people's concrete life. This is what Jesus calls hypocrisy. There can be no society without rules. Yes, we do need them. But Jesus accuses the Pharisees of overburdening themselves and the people with a host of little do's and don'ts, which are but precepts of men. We should not mix up things. To wash one's hands is a healthy habit to be acquired, and again, it's a good thing. It makes clean. It can be necessary in certain circumstances, and it can also be symbolic of inner purity. But Pilate also washed his hands, and it put on another meaning. To kiss somebody was a gesture of esteem and affection, but in Judas' mouth it became a symbol of treason. For the Jews themselves, the washing of hands was a preparatory rite for the sacred moment of the family meal. But this gesture came to be loaded with connotations that had a far-reaching impact. It was supposed to preserve the purity of the Jewish people from others who had been declared impure. It came to signify that sinners, foreigners, and certain sick people like the lepers had to be kept apart, becoming thus a rite of exclusion. The act of cleanliness got diverted of its meaning. Jesus reacted with vigor at this situation. There is nothing outside a man which by going into him can defile him. But the things which come out of a man are what defile him. Jesus seems to say that it is not so much the outside world that makes us impure. It is rather we ourselves who distill impurity within ourselves. It is in our own hearts, out of our own free will, that we decide for or against evil. Among the Jewish themselves, there were those who thought that the essential was not in the rites, and that what was most important was to purify one's heart and remain faithful to the law. This was, for instance, the position held by the prophets. The quote from Isaiah in today's reading, in today's Gospel, is an example of that stance. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. The doctrines they teach are but precepts of men. Jesus will find his bearings in this prophetic attitude. We will see in it the true, great tradition of Israel, that of those who seek God in the secret of their hearts. How to understand the impact of what Jesus tells us today? First of all, this teaching came in handy for the first Christians, as they sought to know if the Jewish rite of purification should be imposed on non-Jewish brothers and sisters who became Christians. The teaching of Jesus was clear. Interior purity is what counts. What is important is the person's decision to adhere to what is good and forsake what is evil, and not the observance of rites tied to a particular culture. The laws on our roads is something good, but it is not a good law that makes good cars, still less good drivers. A good road sign is one thing, to drive well is another thing. Any practice that is different from ours should be assessed from the spirit that inspires it, and not from our own likes and dislikes. This demands a certain kindness on our part, and this openness can help us be evangelized by those who do not share our way of doing things. To finish, I would just like to recall that from the inside, says Jesus, that comes which is impure. But it is also from the inside that comes what is pure and good. It is from the inside that comes the cry of faith. It is also from the inside that come the just attitude towards God and towards the world. If many of the people of our times feel excluded from the call of God, it is not because we observe or do not observe this or that rite. It is simply because of us, and because we do not lead lives that are faithful to the covenant, faithful to the gospel. Just like the Pharisees, we are also witnesses of tradition. At this very moment, we are celebrating what we have received from the apostles, the pillars of our faith. Thus we write down one more page in the tradition of our elders. This Eucharist forms part of our faith, and we are in charge of passing on the relay to those who come after us. We are going to register ourselves as faithful witnesses to the authentic tradition received from the apostles, so that a people of prophets springs up from our midst, and that nobody feels excluded from the gospel or the covenant.